Cutty street lamp. Growing up in a rural farming town, I heard a lot of advice that was supposed to keep me safe. Don't wander into the woods, don't get into strangers' cars, and don't go near the lamp halfway up Cutty Street. The Cutty Street lamp was half superstition, half urban legend. Just like some people tried not to walk on cracks in the sidewalk or didn't like it when black cats crossed their path, people avoided going through the light cast by that street lamp. During the day, the light was off, and no one paid it any more attention than the other 4 lamps on that street. But after dark, anyone sitting on the low brick fence that bordered the cemetery opposite the lamp would see something very interesting. Cutty Street was the most direct route from the east side of the town to the shops in the center, so it wasn't a quiet road when I was a child. I liked to sit opposite the light on nights when I didn't have homework. It made 10-year-old me feel like a hero to have my back to the cemetery and my face to the light no one wanted to walk through as the blood-red sunset faded into darkness. I would sit on the brick wall and weave braids out of the long grass that grew there or pick up a handful of gravel and try to throw it through the 3rd slat in the stormwater drain a half-dozen feet away while I counted how many people avoided the light. Pedestrians looped around the light. Some gave it a wide berth, even crossing the street to be clear of it, while others walked in a tight semicircle, just barely skirting the circle of light the lamp created on the sidewalk. For most people, it was almost a subconscious action. To be fair, it was a strange sort of light. The other 4 lamps lining the sidewalk cast a normal, warm white glow, but that particular lamp's light was tinged blue. It wasn't so strong that it looked clearly wrong, but compared with the lamp 20 feet down the road, it was slightly off. My mother was a very superstitious woman, and among her other advice, don't break any mirrors, don't go to sleep in the middle of a fight, and don't play with Ouija boards. She occasionally reminded me to keep away from the light on Cutty Street. When one of her friends saw me there and passed on the news that I'd been watching the lamp at night, she panicked and, through tears and threats, made me promise not to go near it again. She was a good woman, and I loved her dearly, so I stopped my nightly habit. For the next few years, I saw very little of the light. I still traveled down Cutty Street, usually during the day, and I couldn't stop myself from glancing at the lamp every time I passed it. When I was 12, my cousin came to stay with us for a few weeks. His parents were going through a nasty divorce, and his mother had wanted to give him a break from it. Todd was a year older than me and impressed me as being the height of cool. Todd wasn't an unpleasant person, per se, but he was surly and not entirely happy about being turned out of his home. I was overly eager to please and let him have whatever he wanted. After he complained about how uncomfortable the spare mattress on my room's floor was, I swapped with him so he could sleep in my bed. When we watched movies at night, I always let him pick. I tried to introduce him to my friends, too, but they didn't like hanging out with him. They're babies, he told me one night, lying in my bed, arms folded behind his head as he stared at the ceiling. I don't blame them, though. There's nothing exciting in this town. If they were in the city, they'd harden up real quick. I hated hearing Todd complain about my town, so I cast around for something that would impress him. We had a murder here a few years back, I said. A guy killed his wife and buried her in his backyard. Todd snorted. Just one murder. No serial killers. We've got plenty of those in the city. I was deflated but not deterred. There's also lots of bears in the woods. We've got to bring a gun whenever we go in there. I've seen bears in the zoo, Todd retorted. They're not that scary. Then my brain lighted on the relatively insignificant 6 feet of Cutty Street that had always fascinated me. We have a haunted streetlight. Todd glanced at me out of the corner of my eye, and I knew I'd got his attention. What? There's a lamppost that kills anyone who walks under it. That was, I admit, a pretty big exaggeration. I'd seen a few people walk through the light before, and they'd always shivered and picked up their speed as soon as they realized they'd stepped into the unnatural light. I was 12, though, and trying to impress one of the least impressible people I'd ever met. My cousin had rolled over to fix me with a scrutinizing stare. "You're making this up, aren't you?" "No." I felt offended. "It's real. I can show it to you." "Right now?" "Yeah, sure, whatever." And just like that, we rolled out of our beds, pulled clothes on over our pajamas, and snuck out the back door. My mother watched TV in the front room of the house in the evenings, so it was easy to climb over the backyard fence and into the lane that ran between the houses without her knowing. From there, we could follow Roger Street towards the city center. I knew my mother would check on us before she went to sleep, but that wouldn't be for another hour at least, and I hoped I could show Todd the light, prove that our sleepy little town could be just as impressive as his stupid city, and get us back into our beds without my mother being any wiser. Todd was showing more interest in me than he had since he'd arrived. He asked about the lamp, and I told him about its blue sheen, the cemetery it sat opposite, and the way no one walked through its light. I led Todd to my familiar seat on the cemetery fence and was pleased to see it had hardly changed in the years I'd been away from it. I sat, waited for Todd to grudgingly sit next to me, then pointed to the lamp on the other side of the road. "That's it," he said, skepticism lacing his voice. "It doesn't look that scary." I was miffed, but tried not to let it show. "Can you see the blue light? It's darker than the lamp down that way." Todd squinted between the two lights, not looking impressed. "Maybe a little." "Well, just wait," I snapped. We did. It was a quiet night, and Todd was becoming fidgety by the time a woman entered the street from a side lane and began walking towards the light. I poked my cousin to get his attention, then nodded to the lady. She had her hands in her jacket pockets and was watching the road in front of her, apparently absorbed in her own thoughts. Just as she approached the edge of the light, though, she changed course and stepped onto the road. We watched as she walked in a neat semicircle, leaving at least a foot between herself and the glowing circle cast on the concrete, before returning to the pathway and continuing on her journey. Todd didn't say anything, but he didn't take his eyes off the woman until he'd seen her walk straight through the light cast by the normal lamp down the road. Then he turned to me. "Okay, that was cool." I kept my face serious as I nodded, but I was rejoicing inside. "Okay, we can go back now. There's still 15 minutes until Mum's program ends, so if we hurry." "Not yet." Todd slipped off the brick wall. "I want to check this out." Nervousness fluttered in my stomach as I followed Todd across the road. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice casual, "we can't hang around. If Mum finds us missing, shut up. This will only take a minute." Todd paused just outside the circle of bluish light, staring up at the lamp. I hovered 10 feet away. I'd loved watching people circumnavigate the light, but I'd never considered passing through it myself. Todd spent half a minute staring at the lamp, then stepped directly into the light. The blue glow cast strange shadows on his face, giving him a sickly gray pallor. His eyebrows pulled into a scowl as he turned to look at me. He opened his mouth, but closed it again, apparently deciding against whatever he'd been going to say. He looked a lot less comfortable than he had a minute before. "Okay," I said, anxiety seeping into my voice, "you've seen the lamp. Let's go." Todd looked upwards. His eyes widened as he gazed directly at the light, then his face contorted. A horrible high whine filled my ears, and I realized it was coming from Todd's open mouth. He seemed to be trying to scream but couldn't get the noise to form properly. His eyes bugled, and sweat beaded over his forehead. Every muscle in his face strained, and veins stood out over his forehead like purple worms. Tears started to leak from the corner of his eyes, mingling with the perspiration on his cheeks, as he stared directly into the light. I screamed his name, but he either couldn't hear me or couldn't react. His jaw stretched wider, and the whine became higher, then cut off abruptly as Todd went completely limp and crumpled to the ground. My heart beat painfully in my throat as I stood frozen on the sidewalk. Todd wasn't moving, and he was still inside the circle of light. The entirety of my being screamed against the idea of getting any closer, but I couldn't leave Todd. I squinted, my eyes nearly closed, lunged forward and plunged both hands into the blue-tinted glow. In that terrible second that my hands were inside the light, I felt it. The air was charged with a faint electric current. My skin prickled, and the hairs on my arms stood on end. It felt like what I'd imagined radiation would feel like, but at the same time, it had an otherworldly sensation, like that column of air belonged to a different plane. My fingers seized the back of my cousin's jacket, and I hauled him out of the light as quickly as I could. I dragged Todd at least 10 feet away from the lamp before rolling him over to look at him. His face was frozen in that horrible grimace, eyes open, a small smear of blood marking where his temple had hit the sidewalk. He was as pale as a ghost and completely still. My memories from the rest of that night are disjointed and strange. I don't know if I ran for help or if someone found us, though I suspect it was the latter. I have a clear image of riding in the passenger seat of our car as my mum drove in the wake of the wailing ambulance. As tears ran down her face, I realized I'd done something unforgivable when I told Todd about our lamp. I remember sitting in the waiting room, listening to the doctor explain to my mother that my cousin had suffered a massive cardiac arrest and died at the scene. Todd had only been 13. He'd been healthy, active, and had no history of heart problems. My mother turned to look at me, her eyes swimming with grief and terrible knowledge. Neither of us dared say it, but we both knew the light had taken Todd's life. I never went near the street lamp again. If I needed to get to the town center, I took a longer route to skirt around Cuddy Steak completely. I never spoke about it, didn't let myself think about it, and tried to ignore the persistent nightmares. It was a relief when we moved to a different town some years later, though it looks like I'll never completely escape the light. I'm 26 now and was recently diagnosed with cancerous growths in both of my hands. The doctors say a combination of surgery and chemo has a good chance of being successful, but I don't think the light will let me go that easily. I've had an idea lately, a crazy idea about making a pilgrimage back to my hometown. My mother passed away a few years back, so there's no voice of reason to dissuade me. If I'm going to die, it'll be on my own terms. I want to go back and see the lamp again. I want to stand in its light. I want to know, once and for all, what it is. I want to see what Todd saw. Next story. The mannequin. I followed Jeff down the stairs to the basement, keeping a few feet behind him as he wheezed and grunted his way to the landing. I suspected he didn't get down to the lowest level of his home very often. By the time he unlocked the heavy wooden door, his face was flushed and sweaty. "This is it," he announced, ushering me into the concrete room. "It's a bit messy, but," I looked around. A single mattress, old and frayed, rested in the middle of the floor. It was surrounded by dozens of boxes of all shapes and sizes, as well as furniture shrouded in blankets. A barred, grimy window was positioned nearly at the top of the wall, letting in a narrow square of sunlight. "Nah, it'll be fine," I said. $50 a week, right?" "That's right." Jeff hitched his pants as high as they would go under his bulging stomach. "You can use the bathroom and kitchen upstairs, too. Just clean up after yourself and replace any groceries you take." I nodded and approached the mattress. There were more than a few disconcerting stains on it, but Jeff had been considerate enough to leave a stack of clean sheets, blankets, and a new pillow at the bed's foot. I dropped my backpack, which held the entirety of my worldly possessions, beside the bed. "You can move the boxes and stuff around to give yourself more room," Jeff said, hitching his pants up again as he backed towards the door. "Most of it's junk, anyway. I never got around to cleaning it out." But there are some tables and a chair and stuff you can use. Just don't break anything, and we're good, okay? Sure, I said. Thanks, man. Later, Jeff grunted, closing the door behind himself. His huffing and groaning echoed through the room as he pulled his large frame up the stairwell. I turned back to the basement and gave it a closer look. There was dust everywhere, and some of the boxes looked as though they hadn't been opened in decades. When my girlfriend and I had broken up, we both said some pretty rash things. In retrospect, no, don't bother. Keep the flat, I'm leaving, was one of my less thought-out statements. I was between jobs and didn't have much in the way of savings, so it was pure good fortune that a friend at uni had told me how his Uncle Jeff wanted to rent out his basement. It wasn't pretty, but it was cheap and didn't come with a contract, so I couldn't complain much. I made the bed quickly, out of eagerness to cover up the yellowed stains more than anything, then started working on making my new home more livable. There was hardly any room to stand, so I began pulling boxes away from the bed and stacked them against the walls as high as I could reach. Moving them caused showers of dust and grime to rain down on me, sending me into sneezing fits. One of the boxes rustled suspiciously. Whether it held mice or a cockroach nest, I couldn't have been sure, but I shoved it out of the way as quickly as I could and then dusted my filthy hands on my pants. I pulled the drapery off the furniture to see if any of it was useful. I found a spindly wooden rocking chair, which I set under the narrow window, and a small, round coffee table that could double as a bedside stand and a place to eat dinner. I was tempted to make use of the giant mahogany wardrobe that was missing one door, but my clothing storage needs were better met by the coat rack I found and placed beside the door. Most of the other furniture, the broken washing machine, the unplugged mini-fridge, the bookcase, and the foldable camping chairs weren't much use, so I replaced their cloths and left them where they were. One final piece of furniture, tall and narrow, was nestled in the corner, behind boxes and a few crates of what looked like children's toys. Hoping it might be useful, I struggled to it, but when I pulled away its cloth, I was disappointed and a little disturbed to find a mannequin. The naked figure stood nearly a head taller than I did, and it was made of a smooth, slate-gray ceramic. Its masculine face was tilted upwards to gaze at a corner of the room. It seemed shockingly lifelike, even though its features were only abstract imitations of the real things. The smooth surface below its eyebrows gave the impression of a steady gaze, even though the face had no eyes. The lips were set in a hard line below high cheekbones, and its arms were held out in some unfathomable gesture. Its long fingers were devoid of nails, creases, and fingerprints, but somehow, they seemed just as human as my own. I threw the cloth back over its bald head and rearranged the fabric to ensure every part of the mannequin was covered, then I replaced the boxes and crates in front of it. My back was aching, and I figured the room was about as organized as I could bother making it. Dust and whirls of grime still coated the floor, and my every step kicked up small puffs. I hadn't found a broom during my cleaning, but I supposed Jeff wouldn't mind if I asked to borrow his. I jogged up the stairs and let myself through the door at the top. Jeff's house was large, and he'd only shown me the way from the front door to the basement. As I hesitated on the landing, wondering if it would be less rude to go looking for him or to call his name, my phone beeped. I pulled it out and saw 2 missed messages, one from Tony, asking if I wanted to meet him and the guys at the local pub to celebrate my breakup, and another from Clive, saying they were all waiting for me. A grin slid across my face as I texted back, saying I would be there in 10 minutes. Forgetting the broom, I raced back down the stairs to get my wallet and jacket. I watched the signal on my phone as I descended, and the bars disappeared about halfway down the stairs. Clearly, the basement was a dead zone for Wi-Fi. It was annoying, but I was willing to put up with a lot in exchange for cheap rent. I opened the door and froze as I felt eyes watching me. I looked to my left and saw the mannequin's head, barely visible above the stacked boxes, staring in my direction. I dropped my phone into my pocket, then circled the boxes to escape the gaze of the statue. I mustn't have put the cloth on properly, I realized. A breeze from the open door had probably caused it to slide off. A minute of puffing and clambering got me next to the mannequin. I gathered the fabric from where it was pooled around his feet, then threw it back over him, being extra careful to make sure it would stay put before I extracted myself from the storage area. The pub wasn't far from Jeff's house, and I got there in good time. My 4 friends were already halfway to drunk, so I made quick work of a pint of beer to catch up to them. When Clive asked me to share some of the ways my ex had wronged me, Tony had the bright idea to turn it into a drinking game. We ordered a tray of shots and drank every time I told a story that made my friends hoot in disgust. They were predisposed to hate my ex, and eager to drink, so it wasn't long before we were plastered. We left, or we might have been kicked out, I really can't remember, shortly after midnight. I don't have any memory of finding my way home, but I did, which was a bit of a miracle, truthfully, as I'd only been there once before. I remember fumbling with my keys for what felt like an eternity before I realized I was trying to use the one from my old apartment. When I finally let myself into the house, I tried to creep towards my basement so I wouldn't wake Jeff, but I had forgotten where it was and ended up looping through the house twice before I found the right door. If Jeff heard me, he was generous enough not to disturb my drunken roving. I woke up the next morning with a dry mouth and a splitting headache. I lay there, prone on my dust-covered mattress, for as long as I could before my bladder threatened mutiny. I pulled myself to my feet, ready to stagger upstairs, and nearly walked into the mannequin. It stood at the foot of my bed, its arms splayed out as though to welcome an embrace, its head tilted down to angle its non-existent gaze on me as I slept. I stumbled away from it, became tangled in my bedsheets, slipped, and caught myself on one of the boxes. My headache flared, and for a moment, I thought I would be sick on the floor. Then as I closed my eyes and breathed the dusty air through my nose, memories of the night before filtered through my mind. I remembered spinning around with the mannequin, laughing at how serious he looked and telling him he was almost stiff enough to be a replica of my ex. For whatever reason, drunk me must have thought it would be a brilliant idea to pull the mannequin out from the corner of the room and set him up to watch over me as I slept. I cursed, shambled around the statue, and stomped up the stairs. I'd slept in my clothes and still had my wallet in my pocket, so after relieving myself and splashing water over my face, I decided it would be less painful to go outside than hide in the cramped, dusty basement. I went to one of my favorite local cafes. There was a corner with dim lighting, and the servers knew me well enough that they wouldn't pester me too often, so I hunkered down to drink coffee and wait out my hangover. By the time I felt like a human being again, I was late for a uni lecture I couldn't miss and had to jog to get there on time. Afterwards, Tony invited me to tag along for dinner at a barbecue one of his work friends was throwing. In the end, I didn't get back to Jeff's house until late that night. When I opened the basement door, I was surprised to see the mannequin standing beside the rocking chair under the window. I paused in the doorway, confused and alarmed, until I realized Jeff must have moved it. When he hadn't seen me that morning, he'd probably come downstairs to check on me and found the mannequin poised above my bed. It must have confused him and likely disturbed him a little, so he'd moved it. Great. Now he thinks I put the mannequin there on purpose. Talk about making a first impression. I sighed and half-heartedly kicked my bedsheets back into an approximation of where they should have been, then flopped on top of them. When I split from my ex, I'd left just about everything I owned at our apartment, including my clothes, my laptop, and my uni books. I would need to ask for them back soon, but I dreaded having to carry them the 20 minutes from her apartment to my new basement. I supposed I could ask Tony for help. He was a solid friend and would brave my ex with me like a champ, but I was still holding out for slightly nicer, less cramped accommodations, preferably without a mannequin. I rolled over to look at the ceramic figure. He stood beside the rocking chair, his arms hung limp by his sides, and his face was turned to observe the door. His sightless gaze was disquieting, even when he wasn't looking at me. Sighing, I got up, approached the mannequin and gripped its arms. The fake skin was colder than I'd expected, almost as if he'd been sitting in a fridge. I shuddered, ground my teeth, tightened my grip on the muscular biceps, and began dragging the statue back towards the corner. It was heavier than I'd expected, and I was winded by the time I reached the crates and boxes blocking me from his corner. It was incredible that drunk me had managed to pull him out the night before. I looked at the boxes, judged them to be too numerous and heavy to struggle through, and decided it would be easier to leave the mannequin on my side of them. I pushed him into a gap between two boxes, turned him to face the corner, and borrowed the cloth from on top of the mahogany wardrobe to drape over him. When I was done, it was almost possible to pretend he wasn't there at all. I went upstairs to brush my teeth, shower, and check for messages on my phone. When I got back into the basement, I barely spared a glance at my cloth-covered companion before sliding into bed. I rolled over to face the window and lay there for almost an hour before sleep finally claimed me. My dreams were disjointed. I imagined I was in uni, taking an exam I hadn't studied for. Whenever I looked at the words, they squiggled across the page like worms and resettled in new places to form completely different questions. A tall, dark man with a smooth face stood beside me while I struggled to erase an incorrect answer, and as I watched the words writhe across the pages again, he bent down to whisper in my ear, "Close your eyes." I sat up with a jolt. Pale light filtered through the window, telling me it was morning. I fumbled for my phone on the bedside table. The clock on my phone confirmed it was just after 7, so I got up and searched for fresh clothes on the coat rack. I only had 3 shirts and 2 pairs of pants, and they were all grimy with settled dust. Grumbling, I shook one of the shirts and a pair of pants, sending plumes of tiny hairs and specks swirling in the early morning light, then pulled on the clothes. As I made for the door, I shot a glance at the mannequin. It was no longer where I'd left it, between the boxes. I froze, then rotated slowly, my eyes skimming the room. It wasn't hard to find him. He was posed directly behind the head of the bed, staring down at where I'd been lying just a few minutes before. A stifled laugh spilled out of me. I glanced about the room, searching for some explanation, and failing to find one. The mannequin stood, legs spread on his stand, his bald head tilted downwards. His abs caught a hint of shine from the window's light. I jumped through the doorway, slammed the door behind me, then jogged up the stairs. The house was quiet, Jeff probably wasn't awake yet. I let myself out through the front door, slung the backpack over my shoulders, and jogged down the near-empty street towards my favorite cafe. I stayed there for several hours, stirring a cold mug of coffee and trying not to think about the statue in my new home. I needed someone to talk to, who would listen patiently, wouldn't think I was crazy or stupid, and could give me solid advice. Well, Tony can do 2 out of 3. Just before the lunch crowd started filtering in, I paid my bill, then took the subway to Tony's neighborhood. It was a neglected part of town, but the occasional windowsill potted plant and a small park stopped it from being depressing. I let myself into Tony's apartment complex, climbed the 3 flights of stairs, and knocked on his door. He was home, luckily, though he looked as though he hadn't been awake for long. His round, oily face split into a huge grin when he saw me, and he pulled me into his cluttered 2-room apartment. "How you doing, man?" He shoved a pile of clothes off his couch and waved me into the newly freed space. Then before I could answer, he asked, "Want a beer?" I certainly did, and he fished 2 bottles out of his fridge. As I opened my beer, he sat next to me and fixed me with his brilliantly carefree smile. "What brings you here on such a lovely day?" I took a gulp while I tried to think how to phrase my problem. Even Tony, who fervently believed in the Loch Ness Monster, had limits to what he would swallow. I settled on a vague answer. Something weird is happening in my new apartment. What, like with the house owner? No, he's fine. Things suddenly fell into place, and I felt acutely stupid for not seeing it sooner. An explanation, the only possible explanation, really, for the moving mannequin was Jeff. He'd come down to the basement while I was asleep and put the statue behind my bed as a prank. It was a weird thing for him to do, and it definitely pushed the boundaries of personal space. Still, that was less disturbing than imagining the mannequin was sentient. I snorted and gulped down another bitter mouthful of beer. You know what? It's nothing. Don't worry about it, man. Tony shrugged and turned the TV on. He was quickly absorbed in a soccer match, and I let my mind wander. Jeff had seemed like a jovial person when I'd met him. He was probably waiting for me to bound up the stairs, screaming about walking mannequins so he could slap my back and have a laugh at my expense. Well, that wasn't going to happen. I loved a good prank, but the mannequin was just too creepy to tolerate. When I got back, I would have to confront Jeff and ask him not to move the statue again. I didn't follow soccer, but Tony did, and it was an easy distracting 2 hours. Tony kept fishing more beers from the fridge, and around mid-afternoon, he phoned for a pizza. When I left Tony's house shortly after sundown, I was slightly drunk and much less anxious than I'd been that morning. The air was cool and smelt like rain was on the way. I took my time walking home, taking detours through the nicer parts of town to prolong my freedom before retreating to the basement. When Jeff's house came in sight, I hesitated then quickened my steps. The 2-story house stood out like a beacon. Every light in the place was turned on, and the front door stood open, spilling a rectangle of gold down the steps and onto the sidewalk. I stopped in the doorway and listened to the heavy steps thundering through the back of the house. A moment later, Jeff rounded the corner, his large face beet red from exertion, carrying a suitcase in each hand. He saw me and let his breath out in a rush. You're back. Good. I was going to write you a note. He dropped his suitcases beside the door, wiped the back of his hand across his damp forehead, and gazed about the room. His watery eyes scanned the stack of mail on the narrow hallway table and the phone on the wall. Did something happen? I asked, eyeing Jeff's suitcases warily. If he's leaving, does that mean I need to find a new place to stay? Jeff caught my gaze and gave me a grim smile. Don't worry. I'm not kicking you out. I've got to be out of state for a couple of days, lad. I'm sorry to do this so soon after you've moved in. It's my sister. She's had a fall, and I need to be there for her. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and rubbed it over the rivulets of sweat slipping down his face, his eyes again scanning the room. I don't think I've forgotten anything. You can use whatever's in the fridge, if you like, so it doesn't go off. The bills are all paid, so no worries there. I'm sorry about your sister, I said, but Jeff didn't seem to hear me. A taxi honked from the street, and he grabbed his travel cases. That's for me, lad. Got to go. I'll call if I'm going to be away for more than a few days. Take care, now. He barreled past me, dragging his suitcases towards the waiting taxi. I closed the door behind him, then watched through the curtained windows until the car disappeared. Jeff had left the lights on in the house, so I went through each room, turning them off. He must have only just gotten the call. A mess of clothes littered the floor around his closet, and he'd left the bathroom cabinets open after collecting his toiletries. The offer of free food was too tempting to pass up, so I grabbed some leftover chicken and a soda from the fridge for my dinner. I took a shower, much longer than I would have dared if Jeff had been in the house, changed into a pair of my clean clothes, and set my phone to charge. Then I allowed myself the luxury of watching TV in the living room until tiredness started to gnaw at me. It was getting close to midnight and I made my way down the stairs into the chilly basement. I didn't think Jeff would mind me using the rest of his house while he was gone, but it wouldn't feel right to sleep in his bed, no matter how inviting it was compared to my stiff mattress and dusty concrete room. The mannequin stood where I'd left him, poised over the head of my bed. I closed the door behind myself, dropped my bag beside the coat rack, and picked the mannequin's discarded cloth off the floor. I threw it over his head, blocking his horrible blank profile from my sight, then dragged him back to his proper place, wedged between two boxes near the opposite side of the room. "Looks like it's just you and me for a few days," I said grimly, patting the mannequin's covered head. "Lovely." I turned the light off and stood by the door for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The rectangular window set high in the wall let in just enough moonlight to guide me back to my bed. I kicked off my shoes and crawled under the sheets, shuddering at how unexpectedly cold they were. The rooms upstairs had felt so warm and comfortable that it had been easy to become drowsy, but back in my basement, the tiredness melted away. I lay on my back, frustrated and alert, my eyes seeking out patterns in the stained concrete ceiling while the weak moonlight gradually eroded shadows and built new ones in their place. "You've got to get some sleep," I thought after checking my phone and seeing it was creeping up on 1 in the morning. "You've got classes tomorrow, and you really need to pick up your laptop and study books." Brave the fiery wrath of the Dragon X, I slipped into a thin, unsatisfying sleep, where dreams blended into reality. The light from the window was fading, like a torch that was running out of battery, while the mannequin strode past me, his ceramic joints bending unnaturally as his blank eyes bored into the back of my head. The door gave a soft click, and I jolted into awareness, sitting up and rubbing at my face while I tried to center myself and shake off the dreams. The noise had been too real, too close to have been my imagination, so I fumbled for my phone. I swiped it to turn it on, then pointed the thin glow of its screen towards the basement door. A tall, dark man stood there, as still as stone, staring down at me. I stared back, horrified. My heart was beating in my ear, like a bird trapped in a cage, thrashing its wings against its prison. Not daring to move, I sat in my bed, prepared to dive backwards or defend myself the moment the man moved towards me. The stranger, barely visible in the thin light from my phone, had frozen, as well. I could feel him watching me, waiting to see what I would do. His stillness was unnerving, terrifying, and somehow much worse than motion. The seconds stretched out, each one lasting much longer than they had any right to, while we each waited for the other to make the first move. Then a horrible, crazy thought flitted through my head. What if it isn't an intruder? What if it's the mannequin? I glanced to the right, to where the mannequin should have been propped between the boxes. The phone's light was too weak to make out much more than a cloud of shadows, but I thought I caught sight of the cloth pooled on the floor. Then darkness poured over us. My phone had slipped into hibernation. A weak, terrified sound escaped my lips, and I swiped the phone again, calling the light back. I looked up. The mannequin had moved a full 2 paces towards me in that second of darkness. He was frozen again, poised just shy of the foot of my bed as he loomed over me, his fingers spread by his sides, his blank face angled down at me. I clambered out of bed, the adrenaline lending my shaking limbs strength, and darted backwards, away from the mannequin. I kept my thumb rubbing over the phone's screen, refusing to let it slip back into darkness, as I pointed the screen towards the mannequin like a priest uses his cross to ward off a vampire. I kept backing away, refusing to take my eyes of the statue's back, until I reached the door. I grabbed for the knob with my free hand and twisted it. It stuck. I pulled harder, pushed, then put my shoulder against the door and shoved it as hard as I could. "He locked you in," a nasty voice in my head whispered. "He's got you trapped." "No," I muttered. I stepped away from the door and searched for the plastic box set in the wall. I found the switch and flicked it. Beautiful, sweet light filled the room. I took a series of short gulps of air as I put my phone back into my pocket. I didn't dare take my eyes off the mannequin, but he hadn't moved since that second of darkness. I returned to the door again and jiggled the handle. It wouldn't budge. The spare keys were in my jacket's pocket. I edged around the perimeter of the room until I reached the coat rack, where I fumbled for my corded jacket. The first pocket was empty. So was the second one. I kept going, turning out every pocket in it, until there was no room left for doubt. The keys were gone. They'd been there when I'd let myself into the basement the night before. I remembered putting them back in my pocket before taking off the jacket and hanging it up. And if there was no one in the house except for me and, I stared at the mannequin's muscular back. He wore no clothes and had no pockets. If he took the keys, what did he do with them? The concrete floor was icy cold under my hands as I knelt before the door. There was a gap of nearly an inch between the wood slab and the ground. I spared a glance towards the mannequin to reassure myself he hadn't moved, then I turned my head and looked under the door. The short hallway leading to the stairs was almost pitch black, but a thin sliver of light stretched along the ground. I could just barely make out a glitter of silver at the foot of the first stair, offering tantalizing freedom that was impossible to reach. A crash, a snap, and then the light was gone once again. I scrambled away from the door, stumbled to my feet, and turned to get my back against a wall. The light from the window had faded as the night progressed, making it impossible to see anything except vague hints of shapes. I tugged my phone back out of my pocket, my eyes uselessly scanning the black room, and swiped my mobile on. The mannequin stood beside the light, barely a foot away from where I'd been kneeling. His body faced the wall, but his head had turned to follow me. He held something white in his hands. I stared for a moment, extending my phone forward to push the weak light towards him. He was holding a crumpled plastic square with severed wires trailing from it. The light switch. "You bastard," I whispered. The mannequin didn't reply. He was frozen in the beam of my phone, the indents where his eyes belonged gazing at me. Once again, I felt the overwhelming sensation of being examined, as though his fleshless, lifeless eyes could see far more clearly than my mortal ones. I skittered sideways, towards the window, to get out of his gaze. Panic was building like a knot of cords in my chest, binding my lungs so I couldn't breathe and restricting my limbs so I couldn't move. The waning burst of adrenaline was urging me to do something, flee, fight, just some sort of action, but my exit was locked, and I would rather have died than touched the monster in the basement. "That's what you are," I said, backing towards the window, my feet scraping across the dusty floor as I warded him off with the light from my phone. "A monster." The back of my legs hit the rocking chair, and I let myself slump into it. The rickety legs creaked under my weight, but it didn't break. My mind scrambled to find a way out, but every choice was a dead end. The window above me was too narrow for a person to fit through, even if I could break it open. My phone had no signal in the basement. The door was too thick and solid to break, and without the keys, I had no hope of unlocking it. I glanced past the mannequin. If I could find something, a coat hanger, maybe, to slip through the gap under the door, I could probably hook the keys. But that would mean turning my back to the mannequin again. I instinctively knew that was a terrible mistake, while it was dark, at least. I tilted my head back to gaze at the window above me. It was narrow and had bars like a jail cell's, but it let me see a strip of inky sky pinpricked with stars. If I could hold him off until dawn, I might just have a chance to retrieve the keys and make a break for it. I looked back at the mannequin. He remained as motionless as a statue, posed by the defunct light bulb, looking the other way. "Light's your weakness, huh?" I said. "You can't move as long as I can see you." As usual, there was no reply. I kicked my heels against the ground, sending the rocking chair into a gentle swing. How long until dawn? I turned the phone towards myself for a moment. 3 in the morning. I had at least 2 hours until sunrise. I rotated the phone back to face the room. The mannequin had moved. In the second I'd taken the light off him, he dropped the scrunched plastic from his hand and taken a step towards me. My breath whistled through my lips in a shaky wheeze as we stared each other down. My first impulse was to move out of his line of vision, as I'd done before, but I stopped myself. I didn't want to show signs of weakness in front of my stalker. Maybe this is best, I told the mannequin, while the light jittered over his slate-gray face, casting strange shadows about his eyes. I can watch you, and you can watch me, but no one gets any closer than we are now. Time dragged by. When my arm began to ache, I switched the phone to my left hand. I didn't dare break the mannequin's gaze, even as the shadows behind him jumped and leapt in my dim light, clamoring to surge forward and engulf me and my inhuman companion. As the air became colder, goosebumps rose on my arms, and mist began to plume in front of my face. A couple of times, I thought I saw tiny puffs of chilled air appear around the mannequin's set mouth and ceramic nose, but it might have been a trick played by the light. It was easy to lose track of time in the basement. I kept my chair rocking, using the gentle motion to keep me alert. Each time I kicked against the floor, the worn wooden joints whined in protest. I had my eyes trained on the mannequin, watching the shadows around his eyes quiver as the light shifted from the motion, as I willed myself to stay alert. Then my phone beeped. I knew that noise, and a rush of frantic horror poured through me. I stopped rocking the chair, letting it come to a halt as my feet hit the ground, and stared at the statue with fresh dread. The beep was my phone's warning for low batteries. How didn't I think of this before? It's been on for hours. Of course the battery's going to drain. My mouth was dry when I swallowed, and I felt a small bead of sweat trickle down my neck. I imagined the light going out, dead beyond my power to summon it back, trapping me in the inky blackness with my inhuman companion. A strangled noise caught in my throat. Calm down. Think. Where's the charger? Upstairs, of course, where I'd left it after fueling the phone before bed. Damn it, I whispered. Damn it, damn it, damn it. My hand shook, and the unsteady light allowed the shadows to creep across the mannequin's shoulders and up his legs. The way the darkness danced made his face look as though it were moving. How much battery do I have left? How much time? I eyed the statue, calculating the risk of taking the light off him versus the agony of not knowing how long my battery would last. Then I turned the phone towards myself as quickly as I could. He was in darkness for less than half a second, but when the light returned to him, he'd taken a long step forward. Damn you to hell, I snarled at him. I had 15% of my battery left. I'd charged it just before bed, so having its light on was sucking its power quickly. A headache set into my right temple as I tried to calculate how long that would give me. It was just after 5 in the morning. Surely dawn isn't far away. I remembered a quote, something I'd read in a novel years before, which suddenly felt much more personal. The game of patience has changed into a game of endurance. There was nothing to do but wait and hope. I kicked against the ground again, setting my chair back to rocking. I divided my attention. I still watched the mannequin, but I couldn't stop myself from flicking my eyes towards the window above my head. I kept expecting the fresh morning light to break through the black, but if anything, it seemed to be getting darker. I struggled against my desire to check the time. Taking the light off the mannequin for even a second would give him the freedom he craved, but the slow crawl of time was agony. When my limbs were trembling from exhaustion and cold and my eyes were bleary from staring into the dim light, I couldn't stand it any longer. I flipped the phone around to face myself, then immediately turned it back on the mannequin. He'd taken another long step forward, having the distance between us. I recoiled in my chair, and the pained squeals of its dry wood filled the basement. I'd seen two important things in the moment I'd been able to look at my phone. First, it was 5:42 in the morning. I couldn't remember what time dawn broke, but I suspected it wasn't long after 6. Second, and much more horrifying, my phone's battery was down to the last 2%. As I held the shaking light towards the mannequin's face, I thought his thin, stern lips looked a little different. Maybe it was the exhaustion or the stress getting to me, but they seemed to have curled into a grim smile. "No," I said, using both hands to hold the light, to stop my numb fingers from dropping it. "No, don't come any closer. Don't come any closer. Don't come any closer." I kept the chant up, gasping thin breaths in between and stealing frequent, quick glances at the window, desperate to see any sort of abatement in the smothering darkness. The mannequin, ever still, ever patient, watched me with those intense, eager eyes. I met his gaze, shook my head, and then my light died. "Here it is," Jeff said, huffing as he unlocked the basement door. "I haven't touched anything since I got back." Tony followed the wheezing man into the basement, taking in the surroundings in a quick glance. He recognized his friend's jacket and shirts hanging on a coat rack as well as the backpack sitting by the door. "He didn't take anything?" Tony asked, crossing the room and glancing at the unmade mattress on the floor. "Not that I can tell," Jeff said, rubbing the back of his hand across his forehead. "Weirdest thing. He cleared out while I was visiting my sister. Didn't write a note or anything. He left the key at the foot of the stairs, though." Tony stooped to pick up the phone that had been left on the rocking chair. He pressed the power button, but the battery was dead. "Well, if you hear from him, tell him to get in touch with me. Tell him I'm worried, and his professors say he'll fail if he misses any more classes." Jeff nodded grimly. "D'you want to take his stuff?" "I guess I'd better." Tony grabbed the clothes and phone, stuffed them into the backpack, then followed Jeff towards the stairs. At the threshold of the room, he glanced back, searching for any sign of where or why his friend had disappeared. He saw nothing except the unmade mattress on the floor, the stacks of boxes pushed against the walls, the dilapidated rocking chair sitting under the grimy window, and two slate-gray ceramic mannequins standing against the back wall. Next story. Dead call. 5:08 p.m., Friday the 28th. "Hey, guys, can I get some advice? I've been receiving a lot of dead calls lately. You know the type, you answer the phone, and there's complete silence on the other end. No matter how many times I say, 'Hello. Hello,' they won't speak. Eventually, I hang up in frustration. At first, I thought they were prank calls, but this is the third day, and they won't stop calling. It's happening 15, maybe 16, times a day. Sometimes, I'll get a clump of them together, 5 or 6 within an hour, then they'll space out to one every couple of hours. To be frank, I'm going crazy. Anyone had this happen before?" 11:35 p.m., Friday the 28th. Thanks for all the messages. To answer the most common questions, yes, it's a private number, and no, I can't hear any giggling or breathing on the other end. It's just complete silence. From what you guys are saying, it's probably a machine dialing me from a call center, but I don't know why I never get a human on the other end. I actually yelled at them last time they called, so hopefully that will shut them up. 9:42 a.m., Saturday the 29th. Quick update, they called 9 times last night. 9 times. I set my mobile to silent before I went to bed, but it recorded the messages. They never hung up, just let the voicemail run until it was out of memory, so now I've got an hour and a half of messages filled with complete silence. Fun way to start the weekend, huh? 10:11 a.m., Saturday the 29th. No, unfortunately, I can't just ditch my phone. I don't have a landline, so this is the only way my friends and family can contact me. Thanks for the suggestion to do a redial. I'll try that now. 10:18 a.m., Saturday the 29th. K. Tried redialing. Honestly, I don't know what I expected, but I just got a lot more of the same. They answered after one ring, but I couldn't hear anything. I've tried calling a few times, even hung on the phone for a couple of minutes at one point. Nada. Any other suggestions? 1:55 p.m., Saturday the 29th. So. They're still calling. I'm ignoring them for now and letting the phone ring out. That's not what I'm updating about, though. I played through a couple of the voicemails from last night while I ate my lunch. I figured I'd better, just to make sure there was nothing in them. Now, I'm not superstitious or easily scared. I've gone on ghost tours and can watch horror movies without a problem. But, honestly, those recordings freaked me out. I can't explain it well enough, but I really started to feel like someone was on the other end. It's the strangest, most inexplicably skin-chilling thing I've ever experienced. I'm going to take a walk to clear my head. 3:31 p.m., Saturday the 29th. Thanks for the many kind messages calling me a pansy. You're such sweethearts. I downloaded the first couple of messages onto my computer so I could get a better audio quality. Just in case, you know. Well, when I adjust some of the levels, there is something there. It's not much, and it fluctuates in and out, but it sounds sort of echo-y. Like the message came from a really big, really empty room. I'm going to keep looking. 3:38 p.m., Saturday the 29th. I downloaded the rest of the messages. Most are empty except for that echo, but one had a patch of actual noise. It lasts for about 15 seconds and sounds like someone scratching their fingernails over fabric. That's the best I can describe it. The phone's still ringing, by the way. I've had 12 calls since I got up. I'm not answering them. 4:03 p.m., Saturday the 29th. I uploaded the audio clip as you guys asked. You can hear the sound start at around 0:08 and last until 0:21. It's the only of its type I got out of the messages last night. I let the clip run for another minute so you can hear the echo-y noise, too. Honestly, I don't care who's doing it or why. I just want it to stop. You don't know what it's like hearing that blasted ringtone every hour. I've turned my phone to silent a few times, but I don't want to keep it off for too long in case my family or work needs to contact me. Help. 7:55 p.m., Saturday the 29th. Paul, because it's a private number, my phone company won't give me any details on who owns it. Tori 135, I tried following your instructions on blocking the number, but it didn't work. They called again barely 10 minutes after I'd finished. Maybe it only works on certain phone models. Verve, any help you can give would be greatly appreciated. Yes, my phone contract is with, name redacted. 9:15 a.m., Sunday the 30th. Great news, guys. One of the members here, not going to say names so he doesn't get in trouble, has a brother who works at my phone provider. He bent a few rules and was able to get me the number that's been calling me. I'm off to do some research now. If I can figure out who they are, I should be able to contact them and make them stop. 4:41 p.m., Sunday the 30th. I'm leaving this here in case you guys can make any more sense of it than I could. Once I matched the phone number to an address, it was easy to find information about them online. Really easy, actually. It's been all over the news. Here's a link to one of the articles. The day it occurred is the same day I started getting the calls. I don't know what to think, except that it's time to get a new phone. Copied from the Harab Weekly. Suburban Horror by Natalie Moore. At 2 a.m. on Wednesday the 26th of March, a sinkhole appeared in Jacaranda Street in North Harrop. The sinkhole, approximately 32 meters across, occurred directly under the home of publicist Georgina Gray. In a statement issued by the Harrop Police, Inspector Patterson said, "The entirety of the Gray home, plus part of the adjacent property, collapsed into the sinkhole. It is believed that Mrs. Gray and her 2 children were inside the home at the time of the event. Attempts to retrieve them have so far not yielded results. Police searches have been hindered by the depth of the sinkhole, which is estimated to extend at least 90 meters. According to Inspector Patterson, the chances of any of the Gray household having survived is slim to none, though police are continuing their efforts.